Welcome to What to Do When, a podcast from real lawyers with real perspective, where we explore a variety of legal issues and scenarios. Each week, we focus on a new topic and discuss what to do when and if any of these legal scenarios ever happen to you or a loved one. With over 40 years of combined legal experience, our hosts offer their unique perspectives and insights on a range of real-life legal situations.
Hi, and welcome back to another podcast with Critzer, Cardani here in Richmond, Virginia. I'm Jackie.
I'm Scott. Jackie, what's on the docket for today?
What to do when you want, need, hope to have an annulment.
What is an annulment?
Well, first of all, an annulment is different than a divorce, okay? But it is a method to sever a marital relationship. But boy, is it complicated.
Okay. So explain it to us, Jackie. I mean, it's different than a divorce, so what makes it different?
Well, a divorce, you have to file, the pleadings in the court. You're looking at potentially spousal support. You're looking at equitable distribution. You're looking at all the things that divorces normally look at. Annulment is really asking the court to consider the marriage null and void, like it never happened.
Like it never happened, okay.
So you can imagine there are some very specific circumstances, and only those circumstances where annulment is even allowed under the law in Virginia. So one thing, aside from it being different from divorce, but one thing is that it requires an element of fraud or duress. So fraud being an intentional misrepresentation of a material fact, and not any material fact, but there are some very specific ones listed in the code.
Like prostitution?
Like prostitution. If one of the parties was a prostitute before they got married, and you didn't know it, and later found out after you got married, you can have the marriage annulled if you found out within 2 years of being married, and you filed for an annulment within those 2 years of being married.
So it's a 2-year limit no matter what, right?
2-year limit.
Well, give us some other ones. What are some other possibilities for annulment?
If one party or the other was with child or conceived a child within the 10 months after the date of marriage. So if the child is born within the 10 months after the date of marriage, then the marriage can be annulled even then. So if you fathered a child who was born 6 months after you got married, your wife can have it annulled. If you learn that let's just say your new wife, is due, you don't know she's pregnant because she's not showing, or you just can't tell, whatever the case may be, and she has a baby 6 months after you get married, and you go, the math doesn't work, we didn't have sex until we got married. I realize that's relatively rare, but it happens, okay? You can divorce her if it's not your baby.
Oh, we wouldn't want a divorce, we'd want an annulment.
Annul. You can have an annulment, yes, that's exactly right, from her for having a baby with another fella. And also importantly, if the male is impotent and wife finds out after the marriage and files for annulment within 2 years, then it can be annulled. The marriage can be annulled at that point.
And it's like it never happened. And this can be important for lots of reasons, and I don't know that this is the podcast to go into all the reasons that can be important, but these things we see a lot in the sense of people being dishonest to their spouse. And if you're, the premise I think of annulment is if you're that dishonest at the beginning, that marriage probably isn't going to last long anyways. So they kind of make a clean break and allow you to, you're not a divorcee at that point because you didn't really get into this marriage with the full knowledge that you should have had.
Right.
And so, a marriage has to be built on trust. I don't know any that work that aren't. At some level you have to be able to trust your partner. And if you can't tell them that you were pregnant or you were a prostitute all the way up until the day you got married and continue on afterwards, or one of the other things, it makes for a rocky road. And I think the courts are and the legislature is trying to recognize some options of this fraud, basically, or, if the person's mentally incompetent during the time that it's called solemnization. What the heck is that?
Well, that's when the ceremony's performed and everybody is signed on the dotted line and the ceremony, you are formally married. But there are some circumstances where you might be able to annul a marriage where one of the parties was not at the age of consent to marry in Virginia, which is 18. If you find out that this person was 17, 16. I hope they're not younger than that. Although I know some young people look a lot older than they actually are. But if you find out that you've married someone who's not of age, then it can be void or voidable.
Yeah, there's some things with family members, aren't there, Jackie, with, you know, these kind of voidable marriages kind of things where if you marry a cousin, is that correct? Or is it?
So cousins are a little different, but aunts and uncles can't marry nieces and nephews.
Yeah.
Siblings can't marry one another. The bloodline needs to be pretty watered down before you can marry a relative, but there are circumstances where the marriage can be void or voidable depending on what's been going, what level of relation.
You know, and sometimes, you know, again, these are things sometimes you may not find out. Maybe you didn't know it was you were related because one family or particular is isolated from the other families. And, you know, I remember growing up, I had some cousins who I met later that I didn't even know were my cousins. You know, I knew them my whole life, but I didn't realize they were cousins. So it happens. I mean, this is kind of a little more weird, but it does happen.
Also, importantly, you can't marry someone if you're already married.
No,
it's a void. It's a void. It's not voidable. The difference being void means it didn't happen. Even though you signed and everybody was there and there was a witness, it's not a marriage. It didn't happen. Then there's voidable, which is, you know, the siblings got married. They didn't know they were siblings, even by half. The code says by half blood. Even if you're siblings by half blood, it's still voidable or void. But there are situations where it is absolutely void, and that is when you marry someone or attempt to marry someone when you are already married. I'm not sure where bigamy is legal, but it's definitely not legal in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Absolutely. Can't marry animals. Do things like
that. There's a lot of things you can't do. Well, you know, it's important though that from time to time we get phone calls about, oh, I want an annulment. Part of it, I think, is rooted in the Catholic Church, or at least it used to be, where Catholics believe that you're not allowed to divorce. And so we would sometimes get phone calls about, you know, people wanting an annulment because that would be permissible in the Catholic Church to whatever degree.
And again, that's because of the fraud. You know, it's, you know, there's a lot of churches that don't believe in divorce, and a lot of people want to, not just the Catholic Church, but they don't.
Sure.
They really believe, you know, hey, I got married, I needed to sign. But if you got married and you didn't know the truth, you know, I didn't know Jackie was a prostitute. Oh, sorry, Jackie. No, I mean, seriously, that is a big deal. Or someone.
True.
Not true. But I mean, seriously, you know, these things can be, you know, like you kind of laugh about the impotency thing, but if, you know, you get married and the other spouse is impotent and you didn't know that, that's a big deal. You know, that can really change a marriage relationship and all those kind of things. But the real issue isn't to me, the real issue isn't the deficiency, it's the lack of telling the other person about the deficiency that makes annulment possible.
Well, and that is exactly right, because in the code, it all has to do with without knowledge of.
Yeah.
If you know she was or he was a prostitute, or you knew they were fathering or mothering a child in that requisite time period, or you knew he was impotent and you still married, you can't later raise that, even within your 2 years, you can't later raise that as a grounds for annulment. Now you're in the grounds of divorce because you made a bad bargain. You didn't like the decision you made, but if you knew about it, it's no longer fraud, right? Because that's the intentional misrepresentation of a material fact or hidden truths for the one spouse who would be able to elect to annul.
Yeah, it's an act of commission or omission, you know, something you lied about or you didn't tell about. So
there's an interesting question though. What if, that's interesting. What if the man is impotent and he doesn't tell the spouse one way or the other, and the spouse later, they get married, finds out he is impotent, and the spouse says, well, I don't want an annulment. Can the impotent spouse file for an annulment?
You know, I don't know if I know the answer, but by the code, the way the code's written, it says yes. But I don't know if that's ever been taken, because I think the problem would be that you could say that he's the one that committed the fraud. He doesn't get out.
And he knew it.
Yeah,
right,
he knew
right.
it. But I don't know. But the code doesn't really read like that. But I think the intent of the code, when you read the whole thing, it's really that misrepresentation. So what do you do, Jackie, when you find out? You're in that 2-year window and you find out that, hey, my wife's 6 months pregnant. We didn't have sex prior to marriage. I want out of this thing. What do you have to do?
Get out. stop the relationship. Maybe you can't move out at the moment, right? That's very real for people. They can't just jump ship. Sometimes they can. They can go be with family. They can go be with friends. They can just cease the relationship. If the intent is to move forward with an annulment, you really cannot continue to consummate and move forward in a marital relationship and cohabitate with that person if your intention is to annul the marriage. So you got to stop. You got to stop the relationship.
So if you find out, get out. That's our little phrase. But you have this 2-year window total. So if you find out at 2 years and 1 month, you're in divorce land, you're outside of 2 years and 1 day, really, you're outside of that annulment window.
But if you find out at 1 year and 8 months and you delay filing till after the 2-year limit, you're still out. You have to have it filed within the 2 years. It's a very strict standard.
That's a very good point. So, find out, get out. Do everything you can to stop you cut off the relationship and you say, okay, I'm done, and get out of that marriage. If worse comes to worse, at least move to a different part of the house and start to, separate your finances and do all the things that were really important to show that you are getting out, that you're no longer cohabitating. A lot of people who really love each other, and maybe this is a big hurdle somebody can't get over, they'll make the mistake of continuing, and like she said, consummating the marriage or doing things afterwards and in and out kind of thing. One day she's in, one day she's out. Well, once you've done that back, it's almost like
forgiveness.
It's forgiveness, which is a thing we deal with in divorce all the time. So you got to be real careful with that. And if that's really what you want, you need to pause and figure out, number one, if that's what you want. If you want the annulment,
correct.
And then you really got to pause and you got to wait to make that decision before you do anything else, because anything else could jeopardize your annulment.
So our 3 takeaways today on annulment and whether and when that's an option for you. Number 1, divorce and annulment are not the same. Annulment is to void the marriage or to make it as though it never happened, which means it wouldn't include equitable distribution. It wouldn't include spousal support. It's an effort to you can't erase the marriage, but it is an effort to do that, to say that this should have never happened. And it does require, second takeaway, it does require some element of fraud or misrepresentation of a material fact. 3 of those big ones include if a party is impotent, if either party has fathered or mothered a child within the 10 months of getting married, and also if one party finds out after they've married the other person that there was prostitution involved by the non-knowing spouse. And then once you find those 3 things out,
you got to get out. And remember, you have 2 years to enact this. 2 years is the big one, but when you find out, you got to get out. So it's really important, if you're in this situation, to contact a lawyer, talk about your options, and again, pause and talk and figure out what you want to do.
Well, like and subscribe to Critzer Cardani's What to Do When podcast, and we look forward to catching up with you next time.
Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of What to Do When. For more episodes, be sure to subscribe to our podcast, and we encourage you to check our archives to listen to previous topics. Tune in next week for a new episode and some fresh perspective from Critzer Cardani.